President Joe Biden and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin find themselves at odds over a host of issues in their first phone conversation. Now, Biden's press secretary said the president confronted Putin over recent massive cyber attack and suspected poisoning of Russian opposition figure Alexei Navalny, among other things. Jen Psaki added that Biden aimed to make clear U.S. will act firmly in defense of its national interests and respond to line actions. That was a quote. Other topics discussed included the New START nuclear treaty, the Ukraine conflict, the war in Afghanistan, and Moscow's alleged interference in U.S. elections. Biden has accused his predecessor, Donald Trump, of being too weak on Russia. And now joining us for this news review is Frank Emspak, Emeritus Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Joining us from Madison, Wisconsin, and Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us from Bristol out of the UK. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program. I guess we'll start in the States, since this is a state's issue here, with you, Frank. Hope you're safe and doing well. Your thoughts on what you feel like we're going to be expecting between these two gentlemen? It seems like a heck of a start when it comes to phone calls.
The Democrats have taken a rhetorical position that's consistent to where they've been since 1948 or so, which is rhetorically very strong. I'm going to be tough on Russia. I'm going to tell them what to do. We're going to demand that they behave, you know, this sort of arrogant attitude. But and I think that's to be expected here. They're always on the defensive when it comes to the Republicans, saying to them they're weak on this or weak on that. And so we know it was the Democrats who lost China, for instance, for people who may remember that from 1948 or 50 or whatever. With this instance, though, the Russians reached out to the Americans. Putin initiated the call, or said he'd like to call today. And the reason really was to extend the START treaty, because Trump said he would not do that. And the Russians want to extend that treaty. And apparently they agreed verbally to do so. And I think that's a very, very important move on the part of the Biden administration and, of course, of the Russians. The other things are important in the United States, but the START treaty has strategic implications for the world because it's nuclear war, it's nuclear warheads. And putting a cap on it, even if it's 1,550, which is enough to destroy their planet several times, still, it was important that that be done because all of the other bilateral treaties have been scrapped by the Trump administration. So this is it. And I think it's a very important treaty, both actually and symbolically. And they decided to maintain that.
And Tony, I'd like to welcome you to the program. Your initial thoughts on this initial phone call between the two world leaders.
Well, I do feel quite sorry for Putin having to listen to and suck up a list of conspiracy theories which the United States administration, the deep state in the US, and the mass media here in the West has been building up as anti-Trump propaganda over the last decade or so, including, you know, all sorts of really simply made up accusations against the Russians. But actually, he's absolutely right. What we've just heard is completely correct. Putin has risen above all those really derisory accusations, which really I imagine him doing is kind of shrugging his shoulders and saying, well, difficult to reply to something which is an accusation for something that we've not done. But this is absolutely crucial for Putin to come back and say, well, OK, we'll do what we can about all that, but the START treaty is key. And this is an example of what we've had with the deep state under Trump. And it would be wonderful if Biden keeps to his commitment about reopening these negotiations, because we've also had the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which are these intermediate range nuclear weapons torn up by the Trump administration, blamed, of course, by the Western media on Putin, without any journalists really questioning that, although it's complete nonsense. This is something which has been done. Treaties have been torn up by Trump and his American colleagues. So that should not be a surprise to us, because we've seen Trump pulling out of the climate agreements, out of various other international bodies, including the World Health Organization, stopping the funding for that, for example. And so that's basically where we are. But for the START treaty to get going again, that would give humanity a bit of a breath of fresh air, because in the Reagan era, for all its problems with the absolutely terrible things that Reagan and Thatcher over in Britain did to the economy in those 1980s, one of the things that they did was to put together some really good international peace treaties, even though, of course, it was pretty much, but it was during the Cold War. Now we've had the peace dividend with Russia opening up in Glasnost, and things are actually getting worse and more tense. So Putin has been absolutely spot on in making this a key priority. He doesn't mind if people want to make accusations against him. He just wants to make a treaty which will engender some peace, particularly for Europe, for other parts of the world, because many Europeans are rather fed up with the Americans trying to make mess between the Europeans and the Russians, where, of course, if there was a war broke out in that region, the Americans would be very, very far away from it. So that's, I think, really only reiterating what my friend said, that this is a great call from Putin, particularly to get absolutely the right points on the table.
And Frank, so between the two administrations, Trump and Biden, where do you see, when it comes to policy with Russia, continuity, and where do you see things changing?
I think there will be a less antagonistic or belligerent attitude when it comes to strategic issues like nuclear weapons. I think that there will be increasing pushback by Biden, this sort of arrogant language somewhat on some of these human rights issues, although it doesn't look so hot. I mean, you have this thing on the front page of the paper here of protesters being beaten up in Russia. And, you know, so the day before we had protesters throughout the whole United States being beaten up here, you know. So it's sort of hard to make a moral statement with that, although the administration is going to try. I believe that the areas that they may be able to work out something, although it's going to be difficult, is going to be in the Ukraine. Sooner or later, there has to be a recognition of the facts on the ground in the Ukraine. And that would be a big irritant if both sides could figure out a way to move away from that. We'll see about that. But I think that would be a test in the future. I also believe that some of the other types of treaties may be obsolete. The Open Skies Treaty is sort of obsolete now because of the satellites, so that's not such a concern. But the nuclear weapons treaties, the intermediate range nuclear missile treaties, those types of things need to be strengthened, and I think that would be the key if both parties are willing to do that.
Thank you, Frank. And Tony, I'm going to let you get the last. Biden and Putin locking horns on what issues over the next 4 years?
Well, I think there will be all sorts of new issues come up that they'll lock horns on, because let's look at the geopolitics of this from a literally sitting on the moon, looking down on the planet Earth. What is going on? What we're seeing is actually a lot of ties going on, even though there's been the trade war between the US and China. Look at the Chinese surveillance, the domestic surveillance system, using US military satellites to do its surveillance of its citizens. Look at the US citizens who've been involved in setting up the track and trace, the surveillance system for the Chinese government. We've got people like Henry Kissinger, for example, the war criminal, who has links with China between his place at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York and the Chinese Communist Party. So there's a very strong link between the US and China. I would say it's a kind of Tweedledum, Tweedledee, whereas there's quite a lot of things, particularly to do with surveillance and authoritarianism in China, that there's an elite in the United States that would rather like that. China and America together, but I think Russia is the really big kind of wild card, and that's what they don't like. The American deep state doesn't like about Russia, is it's actually a real independent third force. So I very much hope that we'll see a little bit more common sense and less Russophobia from Europe and the United States under Biden.
Pleasure to have you both on. Frank Emspak, professor joining us out of Madison, Wisconsin, and Tony Gosling, investigative journalist joining us from Bristol. And viewers, that's a wrap for the segment of your Press TV's News Review. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye for now.